One of the sources of wisdom that I enjoy receiving each day is from Stephen Garnis Holmes, a retired United Methodist clergy, who was the founder of the Montana Ballet and Logging Company. The Montana Ballet and Logging Company, which is kind of an odd juxtaposition. It was a humorous and philosophical, somewhat satirical improv drama group. And now in his retirement, he sends out daily meditations. This is his meditation from the scripture that Mike just shared with us. From Luke 13, "Cut this tree down. Why should it be wasting the soil?" And yet the other responded, the one who was tending the tree, "Let it alone until I dig around it and then put manure on it." So Garnis Holmes reflects, what is repulsive to the nose may be sweet to the roots. What is waste to the mind may be food for the soul. What is difficult and disruptive may harbor grace. The beloved, to revive you, will not uproot you, but will leave your roots untouched. Let it alone. Let it be what it is and what it will be, and it will flourish with its hidden blessings. It will flourish with its hidden blessings. Last Sunday, I met with St. Paul's Staff Parish Relations Committee, and one of the questions that our chair, Lois Spitzy, put to me is, what would you say, Marshall, are your priorities as pastor of St. Paul's Church? And without having to hesitate, but just for a moment, I said, relationships, relationships, and relationships. To which I explained, I meant relationships within the congregation, those of us able to join together online, those who may be distant or unable to join us, those who are able to join us here in person. And if you may recall, a few weeks ago, I showed a diagram of what we call the networking relational map. And it showed the people of St. Paul's right in the heart, in the bullseye, in the center of that circle as the core relationships. And then kind of moving out in concentric circles, it showed kind of friends and associates, and so we sometimes call them constituents of the church, those who may have maybe one foot in the church, like perhaps the 12-step groups that meet here in our building. Those are kind of affiliates or associates in some ways. And then as you go out further in rippling circles, groups that are more and more maybe distant from the core group. And when I said relationships, 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 what I was referring to was those core relationships within the congregation, relationships with those who may have some kind of connection or affiliation with St. Paul's, like for instance, maybe the gardeners that garden here in our community garden. Well, they're not members or constituents of the church necessarily. Clearly, they're connected to the church and the property where the church sits. And then on beyond that, some long-term relationships that St. Paul's has enjoyed, such as the Backpack Buddies relationships with Linwood Elementary, or the relationships with the Milwaukee Senior Center, the Meals on Wheels program, the staff and volunteers at the center, and those who are part of that larger community of folks who prepare, who serve and deliver those meals, and in turn, all those people who receive those meals. So these are the kind of concentric circles as we build out from one relationship to another. And then finally, I guess the third relationship I would say is the interrelationship between those various groups. So not only is it these people at the core of St. Paul's or the group of gardeners or AA or the group that participates at the senior center, but it's this web or a network, the interrelationships between those various communities. And I'm going to end my reflection today talking more about those core interrelationships and how important they are. But first, I'm going to go back to the scripture. And as I said earlier, getting a little bit down and dirty, kind of maybe rolling in the mud a little bit. And as I said last Sunday, in my 30 plus years of being a pastor, I don't actually recall ever preaching a sermon on this particular text before. And it is a little kind of unusual, isn't it, to talk about dirt, to talk about manure. It's not what we typically think about as a polite church talk, right? And yet there it is out of the mouth of Jesus. And I wonder how many of you would say at some point in your life, you've had a particular relationship with the soil, the dirt, the terra firma where you lived. Some of you I know probably grew up on farms, so certainly in that case. Some of you may be gardeners now, and yet for many of us, a lot of the time, we really might not give a second thought to the earth, to the soil. I mean, it's just the surface, right? On which we live, on which our buildings are built, on which the roads and bridges that we drive, it's just a flat surface, right? Last week, as I was driving home, I was listening to the TED Radio Hour. It's on from noon to 1. And they had a soil scientist there who was talking about her interest in the soil. And she quoted from a book called The Soil Will Save Us. What in the world could that be about? How can the soil save us? What she was talking about was the interrelationship, the intersection between soil and climate. And it turns out that the soils around the earth together contain more than twice as much carbon as all of the plant life in the entire world. So certainly, yes, we need to be concerned about things like rainforests, right? But what the soil scientist was telling us was that if we were to truly take care of our soils could take care of 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that's currently circulating in our atmosphere. So she encourages us to think that if we would truly take care of our soil around the world, we could also really be improving the atmosphere, reducing the negative impacts of climate change. I think many of us remember how horrifying it was just a year and a half ago in the fall of 2020. When we had wildfires licking at our feet and we were all suffocating under a cloud of smoke. We know that climate change isn't a theory or something that might happen to other people somewhere far away or down the line. We know that it's here and now, that climate change is happening. So one of the ways I want us to think about this particular passage that Jesus tells the story, and the gardener, the one who's charged as chief steward to nurture the garden, pleads with the garden owner, give it another year. Allow me to dig up around it, which means what? Caring for the soil. Allow me to add manure, right? Some compost, some organic matter. And here's, I think, where things get interesting, because if we go back to our human origin story in Genesis, there's kind of twin origin stories. There's Genesis 1, when God creates humankind in God's own image. And then there's Genesis 2, where God takes a lump of clay from the riverbed, some moist clay, teeming with life as we know it. All kinds of microbes, microorganisms, full of life. And Genesis 2 says, God took that lump of clay, and just as a reminder, the name Adam, really comes from Adamah, which means from the clay, from the clay. And we also know this term human, also the same root as humble, also shares the root with humus. Anybody know what humus is, right? That really rich organic part of the soils, right? That has all kinds of organic materials. In other words, as humans, we share this common earthiness, groundedness, right? And in fact, I just mentioned the death this past week of my Brazilian mother. Some of us experienced Ash Wednesday recently with the cross of ashes on our foreheads. And I'm sure you recall that blessing. From dust we came, and to dust we will return. I've presided or officiated at far more funerals than I can begin to count, and yet many of you also are probably familiar with that blessing that that typically comes near the end of the committal service when one's remains are placed in the ground and we say, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. We all know indeed that we are deeply connected to the earth. The earth feeds us. The earth, the soils can save us if, and that's the big if we'll care for the earth, if we take care of the soils, the earth in turn will care for us. And if we're not willing or able to care for the earth on a global scale, the earth will not be able to sustain life as we have known it. It comes down to that. So as stewards of this particular place, this land here where this church has been for 60 years, in the parking lot and the lawns and the community garden and the azaleas out front, all of these things that grow here on this land that has sustained the life of generations here in this congregation, it may be that we're not in a position to directly impact the Amazon rainforest, or as they say, you know, the flicker of a monarch butterfly wing here affects the monsoons in China. But we can think globally and act locally. So again, some of you are part of the Lenten study that's going on right now called Grounded Faith. Grounded Faith is in turn based on a book called Becoming Rooted. Becoming Rooted, written by a Native American Christian theologian, professor at Portland Seminary. He and his wife Edith are co-founders and co-stewards of the Elohe farm out near Yamhill, where they practice sustainable agricultural practices, and they together function as the Elohe Center for Earth Justice. So all this to say that it's all connected. It's all connected. St. Paul's work with the Land and Housing Coalition, St. Paul's hosting the Milwaukee Community Gardens, St. Paul's folks participating in the Lenten study, Grounded Faith. It's all connected. In fact, one of the key points underlying all of this study of grounded faith and becoming rooted is our ultimate interconnectedness. In fact, Randy is one who has really kind of popularized what he calls the harmony way. From his own indigenous background and from talking to indigenous peoples from around the world, from many cultures and many languages and many traditions and many practices, he's found there is this common understanding. It may go by different names in different places, but it is this common understanding which he calls the harmony way, which is a deep appreciation about the interconnectedness of life. From the basic elements, the chemicals, the microorganisms, the larger organisms and being and this interconnectedness of life, and how indigenous peoples, those peoples who lived and were nurtured by this land and in turn nurtured this land for tens of thousands of years before European settlers arrived, that they lived in harmony with the earth. And just one particular practice that I think would be helpful for us to take note of, that part of their stewardship of the earth was in the fall, as the fall rains were beginning, they would do controlled burns to burn off all of the dry grasses that today we call them fuel for fires, right? And so one of the reasons why the wildfires were so horrible here in Oregon recently, because there was so much dry fuel on the ground. And so we know in the wisdom of the indigenous people more than a century ago, as they cared for this earth, this land, this soil, they knew how to care for it. And we need to learn from their example. I'm not saying that we need to follow the example of controlled burns, but that the understanding of the deep interconnectedness of the seasons, of the cycles. So now I want to move from that kind of literal understanding of the ground or the soil to a bit more metaphorical one. I mentioned previously, if you can imagine again that those concentric circles that make up the diagram or illustration of relational networks, with again, if we think of St. Paul's there in the center or core of that diagram, and then those concentric circles as they build out. We've shared recently in the last few weeks about the fact that Amy Merrill and I met last month with leaders, staff from Lott Whitcomb Elementary School, which is just about a mile northeast of us on the way over to, Winco Foods or I-205. That's why I'm pointing that way. And heard about some of the particular challenges that affect students and families there, including poverty, including a high majority of children that come from families that don't speak English as their first language, including kind of precarious immigration status, which might affect anyone in their extended household. And so there's a variety of reasons why they're very challenged when it comes to being ready to learn. And one of the recent decisions that St. Paul's made was to identify or dedicate part of our accumulated backpack funds, $600 of our accumulated backpack funds, to make those available to purchase in-school snacks for children, students attending Lott Whitcomb, because one, they may have very little food at home. Two, because of the schedule, because of COVID and stretching out smaller groups of students, it may be several hours between breakfast or lunch and the end of the day, and so how important snacks are. So Amy Merrill, again, thank you, Amy, is in charge of purchasing and delivering those snacks to Lott Whitcomb School in the very near future. So that's one of those groups out there kind of on the outer ring, if you will, of St. Paul's relational network. Another group that relates to Lott Whitcomb that we are growing in relationship with now also is a group of Spanish-speaking women known as Las Madres de Corazón, the Mothers of Heart, Las Madres de Corazón. They have children who've attended Lott Whitcomb. They have been developing relationships over many years. For the past 2 years, because of COVID, they have not been meeting in person, only online. And our hope is that that group will begin to meet again in person, and St. Paul's will be one of those places where they can gather to meet, to be a welcoming place for them. And we're hoping that's going to be happening here a week from tomorrow on the 28th. We also mentioned, I think recently, that several of us, Linda and Lois and Amy and I, met with representatives from Metropolitan Family Services, whose staff provides coordination for families of young children in the North Clackamas School District. So there are family resource coordinators, one named Patricia, another Matilde, who work with families in North Clackamas School District to help overcome barriers and help navigate systems to have healthier homes and therefore students to have a healthier, stronger start and going on through school. That's their explicit purpose. And what's emerged now is exactly the kind of interactive network that I think is so magnificent. And I just want to share a little bit with you about that because it happened through our relationships with Lot Whitcomb School and the growing relationship with the Las Madres group of Spanish-speaking mothers, that I happened to mention the Milwaukee Community Gardens that are here at St. Paul. And now there's a handful of those women who are very interested, very eager in participating in the community garden here at St. Paul. Good news. Good news. Can you dig it? All right. Can you dig it? All right. All right. But it turns out, there's always got to be a but, right? But it turns out that all of the garden information for the 12 years of the Milwaukee Community Gardens, it's only available in English. And so that represents a major barrier to participation to any gardener who doesn't speak English. It's the guidelines, it's the roles of the volunteers, it's the registration form, it's the list of plants not to grow because they're so invasive, they don't want them to take root and take over the garden as invasive plants, right? They're all in English. So that's a major barrier to participation. And this topic came up in the meeting that we held here a couple of weeks ago with the family resource coordinators from Metropolitan Services. And one of them, Patricia, chose to do in her own time to take the documents home and translate them into Spanish. Now we're still missing the one kind of more technical bulletin about plants not to grow. So we're looking for yet another partner, we hope through OSU Extension and Master Gardeners. Any of you have any connections with OSU Extension? I know we got the Grange represented here, or Master Gardeners. We're looking for some additional help to translate that more technical information. But this is exactly the kind of interrelationships that we want to be cultivating. In fact, all of you, any of you who were part of our Mission Discovery program last spring, and I know there's several of you here and several of you online with us too. A year ago, we were asking the question, how can we learn more of the lived experience of our neighbors? How can we grow in relationship with our neighbors? How can we network with others, including the community gardeners? I remember that specific conversation a year ago. How can we build relationships with the community gardeners? And one of the steps I took was just simply to sign up to be one of the gardeners, to literally be working at grassroots, right? In solidarity with them. And sure enough, there were many, many informal conversations that occurred with other gardeners while they were working in their garden and I was working in my garden. One of them particularly, I especially recall, was clearly an Asian immigrant. She had a very strong accented English, Asian appearance. She was just celebrating, not knowing who I was or what I was connected with. I hadn't introduced myself yet as the pastor of the church. She was telling me how much she appreciates this opportunity to connect deeply with the earth and with the soil, and how important that was to her as an immigrant to have that deeply rooted connection. And furthermore, she went on to start preaching to me the value of the community that grows up around the garden. She was preaching to the choir, right? At that point, I did introduce myself and just celebrated with her, you know, how beautiful her witness was to our interconnectivity. Well, I do have one last thing to share on this subject, and I can imagine some of you may celebrate and some of you may groan, but I'm going to share how last Easter, a year ago, as I was leaving worship, I noticed a family out at the garden, children playing on the play structure right out here beside the garden. And I went up to greet the family, and what turned out to be the mother of several children playing on the play structure. And about the second or third thing she said to me, as I introduced myself as being from the church, was, do you think it would be okay if we painted this play structure? Because it's kind of getting old and a little bit splintery, and I'm kind of afraid that some of my kids playing on it might get some splinters. And I said, well, I'll take that back to the church and see what the church leaders want to do about that. And after some quick review, folks here said, well, we really don't think it's worth putting in that effort. We really think we should probably replace it. And so a year ago, we had an initiative, and we had a plan to use undesignated memorial funds to purchase a new kit, a You Build It, Do It Yourself play structure kit. But with everything that happened a year ago, when we found out about the failure of our heating and ventilation system here in the sanctuary, and then all of the repairs that had to be done over on the parsonage, that initiative for that play structure was tabled, as they say in parliamentary language, right? It was tabled. My hope is that at this point, my proposal is that maybe we pick it up back off the table, as they say in parliamentary language. And I know one of the concerns was, okay, so suppose we buy this kit, like who's gonna put it together? Who's gonna put it up? And this is, again, another place where I think we could probably count on a lot of great interactivity of a work party that could include other gardeners. It could include other neighbors. I think it's an important way that we can literally build community through play and recreation, because it's certainly an asset to families with children who are also gardeners to be able to have the children play safely within arm's length of the gardeners. So I'm not saying that that's what will happen. I'm only saying I'm hoping that's something we might reconsider of picking back up off the table as an opportunity to nurture and be nurtured by this soil, by this earth. Well, I'm a native Oregonian, born and bred in Oregon. However, we sometimes teased about our son, our eldest son, who began in Brazil, was born in Oregon. But we can say in the Brazilian tradition that he was a filho da terra brasileira, which means he's a child of the earth of Brazil. So what does it mean for us to be children of the earth here and now? As we consider how best we can care for this earth, this soil, globally and here locally, let us imagine our way into this conversation with Jesus. Given another period of time, how will we dig up our earth, and how will we enrich the soil, and how will we encourage the fruitfulness of all that is planted here? May God's grace add to our understanding and our commitment. Amen.